When was the last time you were doing something and you forgot to invite Jesus into the process? Now, trust me, I'm not throwing judgment your way. I am the absolute king of doing this. But I want you to think about it. Was it a problem at work? Was it maybe parenting your kids? Or was it just the busyness of life that got in the way? Several years ago, we were visiting my family in Chicago. And on the drive out there, I got a phone call that told me that one of my friends, my next door neighbor, was going to give me their 1994 F-250. And we had been praying for this for a long time. And so when we got home, we jumped out of the car, me and my 5-year-old son, and we ran over next door and we saw the truck. And we went and talked to him and we said, "Thank you so much. This is amazing." She gave me the key and then it began. I realized that there was some things that needed to be done to the truck that I wasn't aware of. So between tires, different cables, and 2 new batteries, I had spent about $2,000, which was all we had budgeted for the entire trip to Chicago. And as missionaries, we don't necessarily make a ton of money, so this was a big expenditure. And therefore, I was forced into a position where I was either going to panic or I was going to pray. Now, at the end of this video, I will explain how Jesus took care of us. And let me tell you, it's nothing short of a God story. My name is JD Goading, and the reason that I started this channel was to take small amounts of text and just simply mine the gold out of it. And the reason I want to do that is so that your relationship with Jesus only improves. And if you wouldn't mind, hit that like and subscribe button. It just simply gets the message out further. Thanks. In the story that I'm telling you today, Jesus literally walks on water. And the thing that I like about it is he scares the disciples to death. It's really funny. I mean, when you think about it, the disciples are in the middle of this sea and they're working so hard and it's just the storm is against them. And Jesus comes up out of nowhere and they think it's a ghost. And Jesus says, "Take heart, it's I." But it's in that moment where you see the compassion of Jesus displayed in the disciples, and you also realize that the disciples were never out of Jesus' sight. So up to this point, there's been a huge miracle that's taken place. Jesus has just fed 5,000 men, which is anywhere from probably 10 to 20,000 people after you count women and children. And as this story develops, the disciples are actually upset at the crowds, and they want Jesus to divorce himself from the crowds. But instead, Jesus has compassion on them because he says they're like sheep without a shepherd. You see, Jesus had compassion on the crowd, not only by feeding them with the miracle of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, like just a miraculous healing, but also by spending time with them all afternoon, teaching them everything they needed to know. And it says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, this is the only spot in the gospel where Jesus makes the disciples do anything. And I wonder, what does it look like for Jesus to make the disciples like, "Okay, boys, you need to get out of here and get out of here now"? What was that conversation like? What does it look like for Jesus to make somebody do something? And the answer is, I really don't know. But what we do know is they got in the boat and they started to head towards the other side. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why would he do that? Why would he send his disciples away? And the answer might lie in 2 different areas. One, he hadn't finished saying what he wanted to say. And the second option, we also know from John 6:15 that the crowd was about to make Jesus king. And so this is not a good thing. And when you think about it, this is a form of flattery. And flattery can be very hard to say no to. I mean, just imagine if 20 people were chanting and shouting your name and they want to make you king. Like, what are you going to do? Well, Jesus dismissed the crowd and then he went up into the mountain to pray. And I think this takes a lot of courage for Jesus to walk away from. Because if Jesus does not walk away from this, he becomes king there, then he doesn't go to the cross. So Jesus is letting go of being a king in this moment to go to the cross to die a horrific death so that he can save all of mankind. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Now, there's no doubt that Jesus was tempted to become king, but he realized in that moment that he needed to get away from that temptation. So he dismissed the crowd and he went to where he could pray in solitude with his Father, because his Father, the Heavenly Father, would give him courage to continue the mission that he was sent to do. And when evening came, the boat was on the sea and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Now, the disciples are clueless to the fact that Jesus is watching them. And what they've probably done is they've dropped the sails and they've taken their oars and they're rowing and rowing and rowing. And this would have been a very hard job. In other words, these are what's called the hard yards. They're doing something that Jesus had told them to do, but yet they're not getting anywhere. Now, many of these guys would be used to this because a lot of the disciples were actually fishermen. But fishermen, even though they would fish at night, they would fish close to the land. They wouldn't be out in the middle of the sea. So this is still a pretty scary environment for them to be in. This would have been an intimidating situation because they were exerting so much effort. They were in the middle of the storm and they were getting absolutely nowhere. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. Now, the fourth watch of the night is somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., so it's probably still dark, and at this point, they would have been so fatigued. And the other thing is, Jesus was not with them. Like, Jesus has always been with them up to this point, but he's not there. So this is probably a bit of a panic time. The crazy thing, though, is Jesus was watching over them the whole time. Like, while he was on the mountain, he saw them. When he walked off the mountain and he started walking over the sea, he was behind them the whole way, watching exactly what they were doing and seeing exactly the position that they were in. And just because they couldn't see Jesus didn't mean Jesus couldn't see them. Now, this whole idea of Jesus walking on the sea, this is not a big deal for him, okay? Jesus is God and he is the creator of all things. And in Isaiah 43:16, it says, "Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea and a path on the mighty waters." In other words, Jesus has no problem doing this. The water is not an obstacle. You know, you and me, we have to build a bridge or use a bridge. We have to use a boat or we have to actually swim because water is an obstacle for us. But for Jesus, it's not a problem at all. But when the disciples saw him, they cried out like they had seen a ghost. And to be fair, if you look at what Jesus has already done in the ministry, like he has kicked a lot of demons out of people. And Jesus is not with them. So are they afraid that possibly there is something supernatural going on that's going to take them out? And to be fair, I would have acted the exact same way. I would have screamed because it's not normal to see somebody who you know walking on the water towards you. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." As soon as they freak out, Jesus reaches out and says, "Take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now, what's interesting about that, where he says, "It is I," it can also be translated as "I am." Like the "I am" that means Yahweh, meaning God. Jesus in that moment is saying that he is the God that pulled the Israelites out of Egypt, and he is the one that is showing up next to their boat walking on the sea. Now, there's a little extra detail that Matthew brings up, and I just want to show it to you real quick. It says this, "And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water.' And he said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took a hold of him, and said to you, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?'" Now, Matthew adds this little detail, and I think it's really helpful for people like me and you. You got to remember, there's 12 guys in the boat. They see Jesus. Peter is somehow able to say, "Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you." Jesus says, "Come." And then Peter gets out of the boat. The other 11 were watching this take place, right? This is an incredible act of faith by Peter. Once Jesus said, "Come," and Peter got out of the boat, how far did he walk? Did he walk 5 feet? Did he walk 10 feet? Did he walk 20 yards? We don't know. But what we do know is as soon as Peter started to realize where he was and what he was doing, he began to sink because his eyes were off of Jesus. Now, I can't tell you how many services I've been to where someone's talked about this story and where they criticized Peter for taking their eyes off Jesus after he had gotten out of the boat and walked on the water. We love to kick Peter in the teeth because of what Jesus said, "O you of little faith," right? But let's look at this a different way. Peter was the only one to get out of the boat. The other 11 were sitting there. Peter had enough faith to get out of the boat and start walking. Yeah, did he sink? Sure. But when he screamed for Jesus, Jesus was right there for him. And I think as Jesus went to save Peter, there was probably like this twinkle in his eye. It was like, why did you doubt? But I can't imagine Jesus not being proud of him for getting out of the boat and walking towards him. Think of it like this. Have you ever yourself had a child or maybe seen a parent with like a 1-year-old little kid? And the little kid is looking to take his first steps, right? And as the kid starts walking, he has his hand on the couch and he starts to kind of, do the weeble wobble. And he takes one step and then he takes a second step and then the third step, he fails. Have you ever seen a parent berate the kid for not finishing his steps? Of course not. Peter had the faith to do something nobody had ever done before. He got out of the boat. I think Jesus would have been smiling at him just as a parent smiles at his kid after he's taken his first couple steps. Like, this is a big deal. This is an important thing that's just happened in Peter's life. And Jesus does save him, and he doesn't shy away from the truth. But the fact is that I don't think this is a place where we should be kicking Peter in the teeth. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This story kind of ends in a strange way, but I want to assure you it does make sense. Remember, the disciples were telling Jesus to divorce himself from the people right before he did the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And in that story, the only thing physically they had was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The disciples were concerned with the physical problem, like there's just not enough food, Jesus, where Jesus couldn't have cared less about that. He was concerned more about giving them the gift of his presence than anything else. Remember, he calls himself the good shepherd. He wants to be with his people, his sheep, right? It's almost like this amazing miracle of feeding thousands of people with 5 loaves and 2 fish is an afterthought for Jesus. Now it says the disciples had hard hearts, and what I think is happening is they were missing the point of both of these stories. For the disciples, as soon as Jesus showed up on the water, their fears were squashed. And in short, they needed Jesus in the boat with them, just like the people on the land, the thousands of people, they needed Jesus as well. The point is this: there's not a single point in our lives where we don't need Jesus. We need him all the time. Now, after we had been given the truck, we were literally on cloud 9. It was amazing. We went over, we looked at it. I had seen this truck as a kid, and I always loved this thing. But as we began to look at it, we realized it needed tires, it needed certain cables, and it needed 2 new batteries. And the realization of, man, I got to spend $2,000 on this thing to get it going really started to set in. So we had stayed at my dad's house for a couple weeks, and we had come to the end, and we literally had like no money. My dad asked me, he said, how much money do you got? And I remember pulling out my wallet, and it was like, I think I had like a $20 bill in it. It was it. And it was kind of embarrassing. It was one of those moments when you just look like a moron because you don't know how to budget yourself. But yet I was putting money into something that had just been given to me. And one thing I didn't say is we had actually been praying for a truck for a really long time. So after that conversation with my dad, I went into my room and I was with my wife. And we're just like, what are we going to do? And the choice to panic or the choice to pray. And so we're like, okay, we're going to pray. And we turn to Isaiah 37:14-20. And this is the story where King Hezekiah is surrounded by the nation of Assyria. And there's a letter that's been sent to him basically mocking him and mocking God. And so Hezekiah takes that letter and he walks into the house of the Lord and he opens it up and he basically just tells the Lord, hey, read this. Like, we're hosed if you don't show up. And then Hezekiah went to bed that night. But when he woke up in the morning, it was 185,000 dead Assyrians outside Jerusalem. Why? Because the angel of the Lord had come and taken care of the problem that had been staring Hezekiah in the face. So as my wife and I prayed, we were out of options. We just prayed, Lord, you have to show up. You've done this amazing miracle in giving us a truck, but we need the money in order to get home to Montana, and there's no other option. And then we went to bed. We woke up the next morning, and we got our kids up, we got them dressed, we got them fed, and we went to church. And now up to this point, I had never experienced a miracle story like this, but my wife and I walked into church that day, and 5 different people between the 2 of us came up to us and either handed us cash or handed us checks. And when we got home that afternoon, we counted it all up, and it was $2,000. And in that moment, it was just chilling because we felt the presence of Jesus right with us. He was there with us. He was looking over us. He had seen us. He had seen our needs. And he provided for us. So then we thank Jesus for providing that amazing miracle so that we could get home. You see, here's the key. Letting God into those hopeless moments where you think it's all over, that is exactly where Jesus wants to be let into your life. So what is the problem for you? Is it something at work? Is it issues with your children? Are there relationships in your life that are just completely on the rocks? It's almost like the problem doesn't matter. It's where you take the problem that matters. Being with Jesus in prayer every day, and especially when stuff gets crazy and you start crying out to him, that's when he shows up. And that's what he's after. We all know that life is tough, but with Jesus, anything is possible. Thanks, and I hope this helps.